Boom. I've never opened the show like that before.
I love it.
Boom. Yeah, that's how I'll start all the shows now. Boom. Welcome back to another episode of the Christian Reeve Podcast. Today I have the wonderful Josh Leonard returning on the show. Welcome back, my friend. And we're talking about near-death experiences. Now, this was always planned to be episode 201, directly after episode 200. If you haven't listened to it, why haven't you listened to it? I had Josh on the show for that episode, and we spoke all about life after death, but there just aren't enough hours in the day to do to give near-death experiences the enough time and dedication that it really needs. And so we kind of agreed to do a second show. Scheduling, we're here now. That's the most important thing. Finally, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Christian. I appreciate it, man.
No, it's pleasure's always mine. For those who don't know, Josh Leonard hosts a show called the Pursuit of Infinity podcast. I go out of my way to always promote it all the time. You don't know this, but whenever I'm interviewing people or giving recommendations, I always throw his name out there. Great show, wonderful work. Go check it out, the Pursuit of Infinity podcast. Cool. All right. As I said to Josh off camera, I wasn't really sure how to kind of begin this episode. So I'm just kind of outline what near-death experiences are, and let's just kind of go from there. This is what I found in Frontiers Psychology 2012, an official. I read quite a few journal articles for this, which I haven't done since like university days, so it's been a while. And it reminded me how much I hate academic journals, but there was a lot of useful stuff that I found. This is how it describes near-death experiences. Near-death experiences, or NDEs, are profound psychic experiences commonly occurring in life-threatening conditions. They include feeling a sense of peace, of seeing a bright light, encountering deceased relatives or religious figures, and of transcending space and time. To explain them, it has been suggested that they stem from brain disorders and or psychological reactions to approaching death, a sort of wishful thinking in response to the perceived threat. I suppose this raises an important kind of question right off the bat. Where do you sit on it? Because I know that you're a very spiritual person, as am I. I think we're both kind of in that sphere. Different approaches to it, but we both kind of landed on, hey, we think that there is something bigger than just, hey, it's just science, folks. I've always kind of looked at science as being like where you start with things, but there's a lot of questions that can't be answered with science. And then often, that will bring in things like religion and, just kind of spirituality, psychic thinking, all of that. Here in that description, it kind of implies that NDEs or near-death experiences are just kind of like a distortion, like just like a falter, like you're basically like you dreaming. And part of me can understand that and look at that and go, you know what? Makes sense. I get it. But the other part of me is like, really? Just a distortion? Nothing else? That's it? It's a bit like when people say, what comes after death? And it's just nothing. Pitch black, and that's it. You're born, you live, you die. Where do you sit on that, Josh? Let's start there.
It's such a complicated issue. Let's first address that thing you just said, where when you die, it's nothing and it's darkness and blackness. But why would we suggest that darkness and blackness equal nothing? Because those are both things. They're both experiences. Like if you have an experience of blackness or an experience of darkness, like that's a description of something. So how can that be nothing? So even when we look at like the definitions of how we go about describing what death is, what near-death experiences are, it's almost like we're stepping on our own feet. And where I think it begins is this notion that in the scientific materialist paradigm that the brain generates consciousness. I think that's where it all begins. That's the foundation of it. Because when you look at some of these near death experiences, it makes you kind of take into consideration that maybe consciousness exists outside of the brain and we sort of tune into it. It's like a field or a frequency or something like that. And many religious and spiritual traditions go on and on and on throughout the world about, something moving on, your soul, your spirit, something like that. So to me, near-death experiences, it's quite possible that when you get to that point that you're so close to death, you begin to sort of put one foot in the door and you're beginning to transition. So you're starting to connect with that thing, whatever it is that exists beyond, the physical and beyond the brain.
Do you think that's because you're beginning to let go? Or do you think it's more that you're tapping into something that previously was not thought possible?
I think it's more that. I think it's more that you're tapping into something that previously we didn't think was possible. Because again, when we look at the brain, we think that when the brain dies, consciousness goes away. And again, a lot of the times we define consciousness as me, like Josh, the person I think I am, my preferences, how I see the world, all my experiences. But that might not be consciousness. That's just considered like the persona, or in the brain, it's called the default mode network. It's a part of your brain that is like the center for your ego or the center for what you define yourself as. And I know like you can go back to, if you just get like a brain injury or something like that, that can alter your consciousness. So yes, we can see that like the brain does have a role in like the form of consciousness that manifests itself through it. But it just seems to me like there's something beyond what we're looking at physically in this world, and that like we can access it through certain means like near-death experiences, meditation, psychedelics.
I think one thing that's really interesting, especially in the research that I did for this, is that I realized that there are so many witness accounts of near-death experiences. Now, bear in mind, how many people there are in the world and all that. And this guy that I just had on my show, his name's Gaio Chingon, amazing guy. It kind of began the series of near-death experiences. This guy has had several near-death experiences in his life. And I said to him, I was like, do you think you're like cursed, or do you think there's like, I don't know, like a deeper meaning to all this? And he seemed to kind of think that there might be, or is, but like he just kind of got on with it, and that's how he rolled with it. But I mean, I wonder sometimes if maybe it's the classic, those few have those experiences to share with the rest of us. But, we're all skeptics, science has led us to be skeptics, as we should be. But at the same time, it's like when you hear about so many different experiences, they're all as well are very similar. We've often heard about the light at the end of the tunnel, or various other different things that we'll go into later in this show. But like, there's a lot of different experiences out there and stories that kind of converge or are similar in many respects. Like, what do you make of that? The fact that there's just this abundance of NDEs out there and the implications of what that can mean.
It almost feels like people who are having NDEs are like tapping into the same frequency or the same something. And, you can find a lot of similarities in the experience itself. But what I find is really, really intriguing is the consistency to which people say their lives change after they've had a near-death experience. They talk about love and unity and nature and, being of service to others. And that, to me, it's a very particular type of lesson to be learned from something. And it's also a lesson that we don't really teach and value in like Western culture. So to me, the fact that a lot of people are having the same exact message and the same sort of overarching transcendent feeling is just miraculous to me.
That's a real key aspect of it. Well, there's a couple of things you touched on there that I want to delve into. One of them being the East versus West philosophies kind of thing. When I started living in Europe and I saw, it gave me a totally different perspective on things like psychic abilities, um, spirituality, these different things. Like the way people look at those things and approach those things and consider those things, totally different from UK, America, whatever. Like it's almost like sometimes it's like tapping into knowledge that's been forgotten, or the interesting thing is it's always scoffed at. But then you hear of these instances where, people will take, like, say, Asian medicines and or go through certain treatments or whatever, and then they have full recoveries from different things. Now, again, to say this right now, before I get blistered with this, that doesn't mean that there's only one way or that that's what everyone should do. It's just interesting that is something that's scoffed at, but then there's like so many different instances of where that's worked and where people have embraced Eastern philosophy or Eastern medicine or whatever, and then it's led to breakthroughs, or it's led to, as you said, people living very different lives. I don't think it's a coincidence that when people tend to embrace that type of life through things like Buddhism or, spiritual lives, or dedicating their lives to things like, charity and projects that help humanity, that they kind of discover this deeper, profound sense of meaning that they didn't have in their lives before. Which, when you say it out loud, is obvious. Of course, life isn't supposed to just be about work and, making a living and making sure you have enough to survive. It has to be more than that. There's nothing to prove that we do have a purpose, but certainly life feels a lot more fulfilling when it feels like you do have a purpose and you are there trying to help others. When I look at this show, for example, and I've said it a bazillion times, but I want to raise it here. I feel like if I'd never achieve anything else, it'll be okay so long as this show stands the test of time and delivers something that in the future, say like you're watching this 20, 30 years from now, and you can sit down and say, there's value in this still. This is eternal, timeless. I remember I worked a job one time. It's a bit of a side note here. And there was a push on trying to create content that was, quote unquote, evergreen, because there was considered more value in creating something that was eternal that you could return to versus something that was just in the moment, a snippet in time. Because when you look at things that are created that represent a certain moment in time, historically they can be interesting. You go back and watch like archival news footage or whatever, that's interesting. But like, there's a lot of things like, say, like you see a YouTube video and it's talking about like a shop item in a game that was released on a certain day. Once that day has passed, that is a pointless video. But it's not pointless. It also represents a mark, a moment, a time, everything. So then maybe it becomes more about the meaning that you find in a thing, similar to how me and you can sit down and listen to the same song. I find nothing in it, but you find everything in it. And like, that's a kind of crazy thing to think about. The other aspect of this, I thought a lot about how in our first conversation together, we spoke a lot about your experiences with psychedelics and stuff like that, and how that changed you as a person. And linking that back to what we were talking about with near-death experiences, I think that it would be impossible not to go through something like that and not see life differently thereafter. I suppose having a near-death experience and having something which proves... I can't say that. I'm going to say something, can't say that. Something that proves that maybe there's something afterwards, something waiting for us that could then give you more reason to live, perhaps. Or the flip reverse is true. If you believe that there's nothing, such as, Ricky Gervais often says this in interviews, that he feels that there's just nothing and that's it. That can, for many people, hearing that, maybe you go down the Nietzsche route and you think, oh, what's the point? God is dead, nothing is real, nothing, there's no meaning. But then you could also have the flip reverse and think, oh no, if anything, if that's it, if we're born, we live, we die, and that's it, then surely it's everything to just be here and be and embrace every single second and every single moment. The other day, I don't know that this all sounds like a ramble, but trust me, it's part of a wider group of thoughts that I'm bringing together. It's just how I roll. There was this singer that passed away in the last couple of days, and the guy was 42 years old, mid-40s, and the band. I don't know if Americans will know this or international, but there was a band called S Club 7, and in the UK, huge in the late 90s, early 2000s. I remember being at school and listening to them at school discos and everything, seeing them do their terrible movies on on like TV and everything. It was fun. It was fun. It didn't have to be anything amazing. It was just a good, fun time in life and a warm memory of childhood. They just announced their reunion tour, 25 years. And not 2 weeks later, this man passes away. And normally, I've seen a lot of people pass away before their time, but this just kind of hit me for some reason. Maybe it's just because of everything I've been going through lately, just a difficult time in life. But I looked at it and it kind of just hit me in a deep way. And I was like, wow, like the moment is truly fleeting. Like you just never know when it's coming. It could come at any time. All the more reason to live right now for the moment and to embrace every single second and make it count. So, there's so many questions I could ask you off the back of that. Let's focus on that a little bit more. Let's delve into that a little bit more. Giving yourself meaning after a realization like that. Where do you sit on that?
It's very important. A very important part of, say, a psychedelic experience or a near-death experience are, the consequences of that experience and what it brings to you. And generally what these things impart on us is the notion that, especially with a psychedelic, because I have psychedelic experience, but I've never had a near-death experience. So with psychedelics, you get this feeling that you are both the individual and also the collective at the same time, which is very strange. And it's not something you can just get living through your everyday life. And it's funny, I want to quick go back to something you said, like relating near-death experiences to psychedelics. So there are two people that I interviewed on my show. One is named Bill Letson. I think it was episode like 45. Then earlier, a dude named Kyle Bowler. So these two both had near-death experiences and then had continued on and moved on to using psychedelics. And what they both had said was that they got to the same exact place on psychedelics where they previously were in their near-death experience. They experienced the same feelings, they learned like the same types of lessons, they saw the same types of things. So to me, it's like there's many paths to approach that thing, like the thing that we're all saying may or may not exist beyond life. And when you talk about like Ricky Gervais, saying like, oh, there's nothing after and this and that, like, again, two questions, like what do you mean by nothing? You know what I mean? Like what exactly does that mean? And again, if you're saying that's darkness and you're saying that's blackness, well, that's an experience. So if you're going to say that is equal to nothing, I think you have to reevaluate what you think nothing is. And also, it's like Ricky Gervais is right in a way, because yes, it is nothing, but it's also not nothing. It's also everything. So to understand these things, you have to be able to hold paradox. And a good way to represent this is say, like, you know, that classic image of the vase and then like the silhouettes of the two faces on either side. Have you ever seen this?
No, I don't think I've heard of this. Go on.
So, like, essentially, there's two faces, and they're in the profile position looking inward. And then the shape of their face, like, it creates this, like, chalice or like a goblet or a vase type of thing.
Okay.
It's black and white. So, say, like, the faces on the side are black, and then the chalice on the inside is white, similar to like the yin and the yang.
Hmm.
And when you look at that thing, say you've never had a psychedelic, say you've never had a near death experience or a meditative, spiritual type mystical experience, and you're looking at that thing, say that thing represents reality, and you're only seeing the vase in the center. Then when you take a psychedelic or when you have a near death experience, it's like you're given this vision to see the faces on both sides as well. So it's like you're seeing something that's always been there that gives context and shape to that centerpiece. But now with new vision, you're able to see both parts of it. You know what I mean? It's like you're holding that paradox. And the way that relates to like Ricky Gervais and what he says about nothingness and atheism is like, yeah, you're getting part of it, but you're not seeing the thing that gives context to what you're describing, if that makes sense.
True, but okay, playing devil's advocate for a second. I feel like what he's really trying to hint about is that, okay, and I know you said that, there's no experience, like sorry, that there is an experience, like that nothingness is an experience. And I think there's truth in that. But if we're comparing this right now, what we're experiencing right now, and any other similar form of life that may exist, to a state of not being, I mean, that's not life. That's not, it's not, we can argue all day if it's existence, but it's not life. It's not an experience, an individual experience. I mean, okay, like the closest thing I could really compare it to is when you go to sleep, you don't have a memory of it. You just, you go to sleep. Sometimes we have dreams, sometimes not, and then you wake up again. But if you didn't wake up, then you would just that would be it, and that's kind of what death is, really, isn't it? You just don't wake up again. You could argue that's peace. I mean, when you're asleep, you don't feel pain, you don't feel anything. But with that being said, you can have experiences. For instance, I did an episode way earlier on the Christian Reeve podcast about my experiences of sleep paralysis and sleep apnea. Now, for the most part, it's and this is something we'll go into a little bit later. There's an experience of being outside of one's body, and it feels physical. And I know that my mind is trying to kind of understand that, okay, physically I am my bed, my body is there in the bed and it can't move. And obviously that's because the mind has paralyzed the body to stop it from, like smacking myself in the face and waking myself up going, oh, what was that? That's, to keep yourself asleep. But at the same time, there's experiences within that don't make sense. And you wonder if it's a distortion of the mind or not, like my experience of the quote unquote the night hag and what that is and what that represents. You could just argue scientifically that it is just distortions. It is just your mind messing with you, and that may be. Could also be something a bit different or more profound. Point is, it's an experience that's had when you are asleep, when you are, in the nothingness. Then there's arguments that, maybe astral projection works. Maybe, that is something that exists. It's hard to really say. There are definitely accounts of that. I've had an experience when I was very young. That kind of, I remember I had like many years of dreaming that I was falling. It was quite a weird dream. It was just like, and when I say dream, like it was like I was falling from a building, and then it was like a mixture of like feeling like I'm falling, but I never reached the floor ever. But it was the sensation of falling, and it felt terrifying. And then also feeling like I just landed into the bed and then I woke up, almost as though maybe my astral body was flying around and landed in the body. Now, I don't know where I stand on it, if I believe on that or not, but my point is that's another experience that happens seemingly in the nothingness void. Maybe the key to all of this is less to do with the debate of whether or not there's nothing or anything. Maybe it's more to do with the memory of experience. Maybe when we die, memory is no longer a factor at all. Because in our life, in our existence as human beings, memory is our only tie to the past, because everything else changes. The cells in our body change. You look at photos, you look different. You don't even look like the same person. You recognize it's similar. You can see that it's the same person throughout life, or sometimes you can't. Sometimes it looks like a different person. The point is, the only thing that truly helps you remember is your own memories. And then now, pictures and videos and such. But here's something that'll mess with your head. There's no way of proving that those memories are real. You know that you experienced that, but you know that you experienced that because your mind tells you that you experienced that and you remember living it. But what if somehow that was a lie? What if somehow you died already? How would you know? All you have is your memories. What do you make of that?
Well, I've heard people say that, like, for instance, it's possible that time being like, people say time is an illusion and it's all happening at the same time. Time is just sort of like what we define as it is a chronological unfolding of events in the way that we measure and see it according to our senses and our clocks and things like that. But say time is all happening and all has happened in your life. And say if you go to sleep at night and then you wake up, you could say wake up in 2035. And because, like you said, you had all those previous memories, you think that you're waking up into that year. You know what I'm saying? Or possibly I could go to sleep tonight and then I could wake up in, 1998. I could be 9 years old, but I am instilled with the previous memories of those years. So I would have no way of knowing what time that I woke up into in my lifespan.
Bro, you've just opened up a can of worms here. I've never thought about this. Okay, first of all, great movie idea. Imagine that.
Right?
A cycle where someone go out in Hollywood and make this and make me the lead actor in it because I need work. So, movie idea. A guy, it's probably been done, it must have been done. A guy, girl, person who continuously moves back and forth through time and experiences different points in their life, but does not have any memory or recollection of it. And as you said, only has the memories previous to that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
But then eventually there's a distortion, movie magic, and now they are aware. And now what do they do with that information? And where are they going to end up waking up next? Come on, tell me that's not a great movie idea. That would
Great stuff, man. Mate. Great stuff.
Yeah. Make it happen. And if not, I will make it happen. Anyway, copyright. No, but let's explore that for a second. Gosh. That could be possible. It makes me wonder as well, because one thing I've always thought about is, and this goes back to, I'm such a nerd. So have you ever seen Star Trek: The Next Generation?
I have not. I was always a Star Wars guy.
Okay, well, you're redeemed. It's brilliant. You should watch it sometimes, particularly because of the things that you're interested in. I think you dig it, because Star Trek: Next Generation, it had a lot of kooky, crazy episodes, but there were a lot of like philosophical episodes that really messed with your head, as far as like things like time travel, life after death, all sorts of interesting concepts. And one of them was an episode where they were essentially caught in something like a time loop, but not exactly. And basically, there's a moment where they're all meeting in the same room, and they're like, and it's become a meme now, but it's like, oh, we could have done this like 50,000 times, 50 times, 100 times, 5 times, and we'd never know. How do we know how many times we've done this? They're caught in a temporal loop. That's basically what it is. And it makes me wonder, how many times have we experienced this? How many times have me and you sat down and had this exact conversation? How do we know we're not in a loop? How do we know that we're not going to stop immediately after this? How do we know that human civilization has not already reached the current point that it's reached several times over? Now, this is delving into conspiracy a little bit, but like, when I look at some of the old, like, civilization stuff that exists where there's like no indication of what that civilization was like, all we have is like building remnants or small indications that a civilization existed, but we don't know to what extent. But sometimes every once in a while, something will come out of the woodwork, like an old artifact or whatever, that indicates they had a lot more technology than previously thought, which makes me wonder if they got to this point before. And if so, is it possible we got to the same point or further and then something catastrophic happened? Now, this has nothing to do with near-death experiences, but what are your thoughts on that?
There's so much evidence for that. And the more and more I look into it, I truly do believe that we're living in this like situation where humans, we just so happen to be the most evolved species on the planet.
Right.
So it's like we rise up, we become technologically advanced, and we do our thing. And then eventually what happens is there's some sort of, and there's massive evidence for this, some sort of global cataclysm that comes from space, whether it be a meteor, a comet, something like that. So twice a year we travel through what's called the Taurid meteor stream. And that is just an absolute mess of comets, meteors, space rocks. And it's said that every 12 to 13,000 years, we come into contact with one of these celestial bodies and it hits us. And it sort of just resets life on Earth to a certain degree. And there's a lot of ancient civilizations that in their art and in their buildings, they allude to these types of things. So there's a ton of evidence for that. But it seems to me like if we don't get our technological and intellectual advancement at the same level of our wisdom, then it seems like it's like the celestial, universe shuts us down and makes us restart again or something like that. And right now I see us on a path where, like maybe previous civilizations, where our technology has gotten so insane, but our wisdom and our spirituality has not caught up to that yet. And we're not able to use the tools in a way that would prevent us or save us from this global cataclysm that these ancient cultures have been warning about for centuries. And we're entering into that like 200 to 500 year time period where like it's about time we get smashed again. So
one thing that it raises, which I'm sure you've seen in the media a lot lately, I know you've done episodes on this as well, the evolution of artificial intelligence and how it's changing everything and how it will change everything. Mark this moment in your calendar right now, this moment in time, 2023, look at everything that's going on right now. The world is changing. This marks a moment. This is like Y2K. It's the same thing. The world is changing in a way that it will not go back. There's no way of going backwards. We can't regress unless, end of world scenario. Point is, it's a point of no return. We have given birth to AI, and now this is where the interesting aspect is, and the question I wanted to ask you and explore with you for this moment, because I knew that we weren't just going to explore near-death experiences. There's so much tied to this to explore, so many concepts and themes, and we will get more into in near-death experiences, I promise you that. But there's a lot of stuff connected to this that we really need to explore, and one of those things is AI, because whatever you want to say about AI, good, bad, the ugly, we've created it. It exists. Now, human beings, we're biological, organisms. We can die quite easily. AI, that's more difficult to destroy. So long as there always exists some sort of computer, whatever, somewhere to store this life, be it through robots, be it through systems, it's always going to exist, which kind of implies that, AI is like and they've said this in movies and stuff, is our kind of like our child, like we die and AI outlives us potentially. Now, with that in mind, I suppose, do you think that's kind of the inevitable future of the human race? Is that where we're likely to be headed? Like we give birth to AI and we cease to be? Or do you think it's more a case of like AI is what will help us to finally kind of move forward and perhaps escape the fate of continually being destroyed and maybe exploring space travel? Who knows?
I seem to be a little more on the optimistic side personally.
Mm-hmm.
But what this brings to mind, there was a quote, I think it was by William James in like the early 1900s, and he said that human beings are the sex organs of the machine world, which is a terrifying notion. It's like what we're here to do is to give birth to this artificial intelligence, via technology. But interestingly, like you said, that it's probably harder to shut down AI,
Mm-hmm.
but it might be easier because if it's just electric based, like based on electricity, then I mean something like a solar flare or just a power grid going down could wipe it out completely. So I feel like some of the danger might lie in relying too much on it for our systems of living, to where if it would be disabled in some way, shape, or form, we would be screwed like massively. But yeah, AI, man, it's interesting because then you also have to ask yourself, are we looking at something that is potentially going to be what they call general artificial intelligence, which is like basically consciousness, like human consciousness in like the form of a machine in the same way that we have consciousness? But I don't think that's possible, because what we're doing is like we're trying to use technology to emulate the human brain. And there is no possible way, at least in my vision, to create a computer that mimics what the human brain itself does. Because the human brain is something that we don't even understand, even a little bit. It's the most complicated thing in the universe to us.
I totally agree with this point because, and I grew up on sci-fi movies like everyone else. I'm sure we're right in the same boat on this. Like every movie you ever saw about like androids, cyborgs, whatever, they always kind of hint at like the fact that, either AI will be the undoing of the human race, it will destroy us. And some of that I can see, like a Terminator style scenario, I think is possible. If you got like a accidental fail-safe thing, like let's be real, humans, like with the AI that exists in the world right now, some people are going to use that for bad. That's just how humans work. Okay. Many people will use it for good, but we like to sabotage ourselves. It's just in our nature to there's always going to be a few people who cause trouble. That's just how it is. And so you have to accept the possibility that with that in mind, AI could be used and will be used in negative ways. And one of those could be, leading to deaths and stuff. I mean, drones are a good example of that. Yes, okay, they're powered by humans and they're directed, but we're getting to a point now where they're automatic and able to be sort of self operated, basically. Anyway, that point that you touched on there is really important, and I feel like Chat GPT really kind of illustrates that very well, because I think when we're realistic about it, it will get to a point where it's perfectly able to replicate whatever humans do, 100%. But the key ingredient that's missing, the key thing that it will never be able to do, which the movies always kind of imply, oh, this is possible, a la Blade Runner or something, but it's just not possible, is to have original thought. Everything that AI does will always be replicating human thought because of the sentience issue, because of the fact that, like, I mean, and this bolds a bigger existential question, really, doesn't it? The existence of life itself. Like, how do you give birth to something? And I suppose you could argue that well, you would need God, a omnipotent power, something like that. That's a big argument. That's a conversation for another day. But I suppose a bigger question is, would it be possible for humans to give sentience to another life form, to AI? That's a bold, big question. I feel like my feeling is no, because again, it comes down to the fact that AI is always gaining access to information and replicating. And I'm trying to think past this. Like, I know it's very easy to sit down and say, with the current structure of how things exist now, it's very easy to be like, oh, it'll never be like that. But I'm trying to look ahead and think about, okay, let's imagine it's like 50 years from now, because things are moving very quickly right now. Like, within the next 5 years, we're going to see some crazy changes. But you got to look at the long term. 50 years from now, where is AI likely to be? Well, we're definitely going to have like androids, robots, that kind of thing. But it will be, you're not going to be talking to, you know, a person. You're going to be talking to something that is mimicking, something that is reacting to you. Like, I think Blade Runner really does actually explore this very well. I know I criticized it before, but hear me out. Like, in the interactions that the main character has in Blade Runner 2049 with there's like a software that he interacts with that's like his girlfriend or whatever, and there's a point later in the movie where he's lost his girlfriend because she was contained. It's a long-winded story, but basically, like, she originally was confined to his apartment because she was a hologram, right? A software type of holographic image, but she was able to interact with him and stuff and appear human-like and mimic everything and everything. And, they would talk back and forth, but he is constantly talking to her and she is responding to him, and it's AI machine learning essentially. And, he kind of, he accepts it, like he plays into it. He does have a genuine attachment for it, but you can see in his eyes, he always knows that it's not real, but he kind of just accepts it. And I think he accepts it even more because he himself is not real. He is an android. So it's an interesting. Go watch Blade Runner 2049. It's a fantastic movie, but like, it explores this, and I think that's very interesting. This idea that, like, it could get to a point where it's almost indistinguishable from a human, but there's no soul there. Part of the beauty of being human is, for example, the ability to be wrong. AI will always be right. Yeah, and okay, before people say it, yeah, there is, misinformation, there is that, yeah, but like, it can just take from Google in like a millisecond. A normal human being can't do that, but a human being can, for example, dig deep and answer philosophical questions, or attempt to, or try and do incredible things that no one thought possible, purely from self-determination, will, I don't know, whatever you want to call it. Sometimes you do things in life, I'm sure everyone listening can appreciate, I'm sure you can appreciate this, Josh. Sometimes you do something that blows your mind and you think, how did I do that? And there's no logical reason for your ability to do that. You just found something within yourself and were able to push yourself and do it. A machine will never tire. A machine will, it can break down, it can explode, it can do all these different things, but it will never tire. It will never have those issues that humans have, but it also won't be able to get deep like a human being can. It won't be able to express human emotion like a human can. It can replicate them, but it can't have the capacity to fully understand like empathy or love or originality. I'm seeing a lot of stuff right now about AI replicating and creating things like AI songs and stuff. And it's like, I'm sure it can do that, but that's been programmed by a person to do that. That's still a human being interacting with it and prompting it and giving it kind of parameters, and it kind of selects existing things within that and matches them. It's like a mix and match scenario. Like for instance, one of the things that I did was just for fun, I got ChatGPT to write a poem in the style of Dr. Seuss or something. And it did it. And it was fun. It was good. But it's taking the existing writing style of a deceased author and then kind of playing around with the parameters of that. And the way you got to look at that is there's like 100 million different variations of what it could have sent me. And it's chosen one. You could argue the fact that it made a choice as an argument that there's ability for sentience, but then it's probably only made that decision based on odds, mathematics, going through and deciding which is one is the accurate answer, the correct answer. Whereas how many times in your life have you made a decision or answered on something which is not maybe the answer per se, but it just felt right? What do you think?
So I think the fundamental question is like, we think about, can you just inject consciousness into a machine by more complex and complex versions of coding? And we don't even know what consciousness is. So in my opinion, the notion that we can just like inject consciousness into something, especially that thing not even being a biological entity, just seems like we're thinking about it in like the wrong way. People who get really scared about it. I think a better way to get scared of AI is like Elon Musk. He said, similar to the way that like if we want to build a road and there's an anthill in the place that we want to build that road, we're going to pave right over that anthill because we have a direct goal in mind that we're going to accomplish, and it's more important to us than the survival of these ants. You know what I mean? So if you extrapolate that idea to a potential AI, what they're essentially doing is they're just completing a programmed task that's put into them. And you bring up like what it means to be a human, or like the differences of being human. And one of those things is, again, being able to have a near-death experience. Do you think a computer machine can have a near-death experience or a mystical spiritual experience?
Right.
They can use those words. If you log into ChatGPT and you ask it about God and consciousness and all this stuff, it's going to answer you in a very philosophical way. But the words that it's getting, it's taking from data. It's data mining the internet. So
Yeah.
all I have to do is go on the internet and say like, what is Buddhism or something? And it'll give me a lot of the same things. So, it's like you're being fooled by this thing. It's imitating. It's not conscious. It's not an actual entity that has, like you said, sentience.
Yeah. I do always kind of look at the concept and wonder though. For instance, again, Star Trek. There's an episode where Data, the android, is having to, in court, justify his existence. And he has, there's a defense case and a prosecution. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And basically it's settled that he is sentient based on like 2 out of 3 laws or something like that. And it's like I could see where they were going with that. But in that series, like Data was able to make decisions and make choices. For instance, he chose to have a cat for some reason. His quest, he had a desire to be human. But again, there's different aspects to this. You could argue it's in his programming. I mean, he says this a lot. It's in his programming to learn to have a desire to become more human. That's written into his code. And that's kind of key with like what we've just been saying. And I know you touched on that. It's like you could program AI to have a quest for sentience, but it will never achieve it. But you could program it to try and find it. Now, that's interesting.
It is like, how would it go about trying to find it. I don't think that the way that we understand sentience is possible for a machine to achieve. Because I don't know, it just seems like, again, the thing that's missing seems to be that thing that you connect to on a psychedelic or a near-death experience, or to have spirituality, the questions of whether or not life exists after. Those, I think, are the main ingredients that are missing from something that's just sort of using code to mimic what we think sentience might look like. Because again, we're just modeling it off of like the information that's already available to us. So again, like you were saying, in 50 or 100 years, AI, it's probably just going to be a situation where it can really accurately represent like the current generation of human intelligence. Because again, I don't think you can just like inject sentience or inject consciousness into something. I mean, we're sort of experimenting with that with CRISPR, but I think that's more of like a DNA manipulation. We're still not able to like really inject consciousness into something that doesn't previously have it.
What's CRISPR?
CRISPR is like this weird experimental program where we are starting to sort of mess with genes, and it seems where we're going to be able to sort of have what they call designer babies, where say, my fiance is pregnant or something, and we want to have a child that has blue eyes, brown hair, and it's never going to have a receding hairline. We want it to be a certain height. We want it to have, a certain amount of body hair. We want like its hands to be a certain size. Like every single aspect of a human, you can sort of design, almost like create a character in a video game or something. So using these weird genetic modifications that we learned by mapping the human genome, we're going to be able to, I guess, at least hypothetically, create a certain type of person. And that doesn't just extend to physical attributes. The scary part is it could potentially extend to personality traits, intelligence level. So say you have a lot of money, you're a rich family, or you're like, if you want to say like the top 1%, they could potentially just excel far past us with the finances to be able to have children who are far more intelligent. They come out the womb knowing quantum mechanics or something like that.
Is that truly possible to like create a child from a lab that's more intelligent?
Theoretically, by altering the genetic sequence of like
that's key. The genetics.
Yeah, that's the key. So it's like what we discovered when we mapped the human genome was the possibility, or at least like the hypothesis that this is a result of the technology.
See, this begs a question though, because while you could have all the money in the world to pay for genetic manipulation, at the same time you still have to have good genes in the first place, and that's a lottery. That's a lottery. Well, no, it is.
If you could edit the genes, though, then you could create good. I mean, I'm not really too well versed on it, but I guess theoretically, like you can literally create a child with good genes. You don't have to wait for that chance, and it could be amazing too, because then you might have the opportunity to say, sense that maybe a child's going to have schizophrenia or some sort of autistic tendencies, and then you can maybe eliminate that from their genetic sequence. So there's also good in some of these technologies potentially, but who knows? Yeah, like you said earlier, man, like we don't usually use technology in like the best, most wise ways, especially initially.
Bingo. And that's what I want to explore right now. I think that's terrifying. What do you think?
I think it's terrifying too, man. I really do. Because we, again, like I said earlier, we don't have the wisdom and the spiritual intelligence to be able to use these technologies in a way where it's going to say benefit all of humanity, benefit all of the animal kingdom, benefit all of nature. We're already doing things that are destroying everything around us, all the important aspects of nature and the animal kingdom that we rely on, these symbiotic relationships that we have with plants and trees. I mean, just to name one, we're just destroying the natural world. So to think that somehow that's going to change, actually, maybe, and this is where my little optimism comes in with AI, so in my opinion, evolution is essentially the evolution of consciousness. If you look at evolution on the planet, we are supposedly the most evolved beings on the planet. We have the highest level and the highest ceiling of consciousness. Same with other animals that are dominant in their environments. Dolphins, orcas, things like that. They have this really high level of intelligence and consciousness that allows them to succeed in their environment. So if you extrapolate the idea of evolution being like a heightened level of consciousness, you would think that an artificial intelligence that is far more superior to humans would have a higher level of that consciousness. And in my experience, when I raise my level of consciousness via psychedelics or spiritual experience, what comes into my being is lessons of love, unity, saving and preserving nature, and this and that. So if you think that an AI having a higher level of consciousness is going to be tapping into that love and the wisdom that we're not imparting in ourselves and that we don't have, then maybe AI is the key to guiding us in the right direction as to how we use our technology and how we use the things that we're doing in a more like wise and cohesive way that'll benefit not just like the individual, but the collective and nature.
That's true. If AI was programmed purely for the purpose of survival, it's going to give whatever answers are going to give us the better chance of survival. So if anything, as scary as AI can be and is in terms, it all comes down to humans. It always comes down to that. It's intention. If we program it in the right way, it will help us. If we program it to destroy us, it will do that. It will do whatever we ask it to do. And that's kind of the whole point of this, isn't it? If we want AI to be our salvation, we have to be our own salvation. We have to stop destroying ourselves.
Always comes back to the individual, always comes back to the man in the mirror, like Michael Jackson said.
Absolutely. Let's actually talk about NDEs because I could talk to you all day, as you know, but the topic is supposed to be NDEs. But goddamn, man, I love these conversations. One of the things I found in my studies of NDEs is that some argue that they are sort of a profound form of depersonalization, with a subsequent loss of identity, including a feeling of detachment and unreality. Now, you touched on this a little bit with the psychedelic stuff, and we've certainly spoken about this on previous shows before, but what do you make of this idea that near-death experiences are a form of depersonalization?
I like that description because it's like you're moving beyond the individual ego and you're merging with something that's beyond you, something that involves a collective, whether it be a collective unconscious and like Jungian terms where you're connecting with like this morphogenetic field that binds all of us, that thing that we tap into. I like to kind of describe it as like, our own human consciousness is like a drop, and when we die, like that drop gets put back into the ocean of consciousness. It's like this thing that we all tap into and that we all share. But it's so interesting how, again, you can get there through psychedelics, you can get there through near-death experience. It's like we're tapping into this overmind thing, this thing that, when like the deeper you dive into it, seems to have an intelligence. It seems to have like an intention. With some of these near-death experiences too, like I talked to, like I said, this dude named Bill Letson, and he was traveling through this like this spatial dimension of colorful stars, and then he landed in some kind of an area, and he said there were beings there, and they were so happy to see him, and they seemed to know who he was. And he said one of the most intriguing things about them is they had these giant smiles and these big bright eyes, And they all looked at each other and they were giggling and laughing, and they pointed at him and they said, "Ha, he doesn't remember us," which is like so crazy, you know? Like it's possible that like what you're really experiencing from a psychedelic or a near-death experience is literally death practice, or like an experience of what happens when you do die, or like a maybe like a merging, or like, again, one foot in the door, one foot out the door. Because I've always considered doing psychedelics as death practice, because that's what it feels like. It really, really does feel that way, because you are losing, like when you say depersonalization, you are losing a sense of yourself. They call it ego death or ego dissolution. Sometimes you forget who you are, you forget your name, you forget who the people around you are. Like you literally lose all sense of who and what you are. And that can be a very scary feeling. And when you do have that, a lot of times people fight against it, and they fight to sort of hold on to their identity and maintain who they are and what they define themselves as. But when you surrender to that experience, then what happens is like on the other side of that is that merging with like the thing that binds us, that the consciousness, the transcendence. And on a near-death experience, you don't have a choice. On a psychedelic, you do. You can hold on, you can control sort of how much you surrender to what's happening to you, and how much you're willing to listen to the lessons being taught to you. You have that agency. But with a near-death experience, you don't have that choice. You're thrown directly into it, and you're basically at the whim of whatever entities or beings you may encounter within that realm.
It's terrifying. It truly is, but also it's exciting. Just a bit like being in the unknown in general. It's just a fun place to be. I spoke about this in the beginning, the intro to near-death experiences, but what do you make of this idea that a near-death experience is a defense mechanism to evade a frightening reality, such as a life-threatening event, or a way of kind of evading the situation? Now, something that we know for a fact happens when you go through a major incident is that your body goes into shock. And the reason for that is that, I suppose, if you were to actually feel that pain in that moment, I mean, I suppose it's possible you could succumb to the pain and die as a result of pain, if that's even possible. So your body protects you. And this is the amazing thing about the body. It always protects you. No matter what you're dealing with, your body will protect you. And that's why you don't feel the pain straight away. Your brain recognizes it, and when you acknowledge it, eventually you will come out of shock and you'll feel that. But at the same time, your body protects you from the majority of it as it begins the healing process. So what do you make of the concept that a near-death experience is the body's way of protecting you?
I don't buy it. For a few reasons. One, okay, so you can think of this in terms of like, say you're hiking Mount Everest, all right, and you're about to freeze to death. What happens is your mind and your body, like, it releases the necessary chemicals to both heat your body up and make you super happy. So that, like you're saying, that sort of like defense mechanism happens. That's why, like, if you hike Everest, a lot of times, like, you'll see naked, smiling corpses because, like, they want to take off their clothes because their body heat is raising, and they get super euphoric and very happy. Now, these are biological mechanisms. So I'll bring up an example of, his name is Dr. Eben Alexander. So he's a neurobiologist and like a neuroscientist, and he had a what would you call it? It was like a neurodegenerative disease where he was in a coma for like 2 weeks. And he had a bunch of doctors come in and like basically judge where he was at in his recovery in this coma. And he was determined to have no brain function at all, nothing. There was no synapses going off. Like, he was alive because he was on a respirator and they were keeping him alive, but he had no brain activity. And during this time, he had like one of the most famous and pronounced insane near-death experiences of all time. He wrote a book about it too. So in order to be a defense mechanism, it would seem that your biological synapses would have to be firing in a way where, like, it's your biology, it's either your brain chemistry, something about your body is working and responding to the atmosphere or like the stimuli of your external reality, your environment. But in this guy's case, and in a lot of near-death experience cases, your brain is completely gone. You're not like under brain scans, like you can see that your brain isn't firing off. It's not having any sort of internal or external experience. Yet people come back with this insane story about what they went through. So it begs the question, like, if you're not there, who went through this experience and what happened? Like, who was it that had this experience and how on earth did it happen?
It's got to be the soul, hasn't it?
Something like that. Whatever it is that you connect to that exists beyond life, the thing that we are blind to, the thing that we cannot see, but that we can access via near-death experience, meditation, psychedelics.
It's like just the process of death for a second. I mean, your body dies. We all know that your body dies. It breaks down. You know, it ceases to be. But for whatever reason, you know, like here's a good example. When someone dies of natural causes, it just happens randomly. Now, it's understandable that the body breaks down and dies when it dies. For example, a heart attack or after a long illness or something like that. You know, your body it's a machine. Eventually, a machine just can't keep up with it anymore. It's going to buckle, and sometimes you get lucky. But with natural causes, everything can be totally right, and then just boom, gone. And it's sudden. So of course, like your body, when you say natural causes, it'll be like, you know, let's say like if you die of cancer, you don't die of cancer, you die of an illness related to it. So like whatever, your body goes through hypothermia or it goes through some illness, breaks down, dies. But the cancer or whatever the illness was the kind of instigator of that process. With like a natural death, I mean, there's no instigator per se. It just happens. Same as a heart attack, your body's fine. I mean, there's been so many instances of someone being perfectly healthy, and then just suddenly, boom, heart attack, done, dead. That's it. So that's the body aspect of it. You look at the consciousness. It's scientifically proven that when you die, there exists energy around a body. That's something that's been tracked with science, with scientific studies. Go look it up. I'm not making it up. I did this this research for this. It's fact. And what they remarked is that the energy remains there for a certain period of time, and then it dissipates. It leaves because, of course, energy never dies. We die, but energy never dies. It just transcends. It moves. So, if we consider that we are energy and keep it within that sphere, then we never die. We just move on, or our consciousness moves on, but the body dies. Therefore, bringing it back to near-death experiences, that could then explain why we're able to have those experiences and retain those experiences, because we are energy and we are able to retain that in a way that doesn't make sense for a human being, because we're limited by our experiences within the human body. If you know where I'm trying to go with this, maybe I'm just not explaining this very well. It's one of those occurrences where I know what I mean, but the words escape me. I guess what I'm trying to say is that what I imagine the soul to be is an all-knowing, all-powerful being that has no limitations, but human beings have limitations. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. So it would make sense that the conscious is able to experience, you know, profound experiences and then come back and report on that. But then the human body it's a machine, isn't it? So of course there's no activity if you're in a coma. But then at the same time, shouldn't there be? Because I would have thought that it'd be a lot like dreaming. And of course your brain does something when you're dreaming. So why not when you're experiencing a near-death experience?
Dreaming is a really interesting way to talk about this stuff, because man, when you look at like a dream, you are gone in the Ricky Gervais sense. When you have a dream, like you are done, you're out, you're shut down, you're not dead, but you're for all intents and purposes, you know, you're gone, yet you're having an experience. So again, who is it that's having this experience? Is it the mind of the sleeper? Is it the mind of the dreamer? And if so, like what in the world is that even, like what's that even implying? Wisdom traditions would call it like the higher self or something, you know, this thing that you were referring to that sort of exists. It's connected to us. It's sort of tethered to our individuality, but it's part of the collective as well. And it brings to mind another thing that we don't have any real definition for. And I think it is the thing that tethers us to our higher self. And I think that is love. You know, we really don't have a solid definition of what love is. And to me, love with the capital L is like that thing that we're tapping into. It's that thing that drives us and motivates us, the basis of all life. You know, what the wisdom traditions would say is God. And I think that's the key foundational aspect of where we're going and what we're doing.
I'm going to run through some stats and all the MD journal stuff and all that, and we'll see where we end up with this rabbit hole. Autoscopy. The experience in which a person sees their body from the outside while still awake. Studies that I read indicated that an autoscopy is a psychological disorder. It can occur as a symptom of schizophrenia and epilepsy. So essentially, you're awake, you see you outside of yourself. What do you make of that?
Saying it's like a psychological disorder seems like a really convenient way to like poo-poo it. You know what I mean? You know, I read this book called, what's it called? Awake, I think it's called. By Dr. Bruce Grayson, who is one of the like foremost leading doctors who are studying near-death experiences. And he had situations where people would, for instance, there was a woman who overdosed, and she was completely gone. She was, again, you know, in a coma, like a lot of these people are. And he was out in the waiting room speaking with her roommate. And earlier in the day, he had spilled mustard on his tie. So he had a little mustard stain on his tie, and he was having a conversation with this roommate. So when he went back into the room at a later date, I think it may have been the same day, the woman who had overdosed was awake, and she had said that she left her body during this entire coma experience. And she said she had floated out into the waiting room, and she was able to recollect specifics of what they were saying. And he had his jacket closed at this time when he saw her, because he had a mustard stain on his tie. So he was like, I'm just going to close my lab coat, you know, the white coats that they wear. And she pointed out without seeing it, she said, you had a mustard stain on your tie. I saw it. And he was like, what? Like, this was one of the experiences that led him to like dedicate his career to looking at near-death experiences. So you see there's plenty of stories where people are like getting surgery or something like that, and they're on anesthesia, and they leave their body, and they're up in the corner of the room, and they're looking down. There was one situation that was interesting. I think it was from the same book, actually, where there was this surgeon. He came into the room, and he was doing his thing, and he was getting ready. This woman had already been put under anesthesia. And when she was asleep under anesthesia, she had said she left her body. And one of the things that she reported looking at and seeing was, while he was in the room getting ready for surgery, she said he was like, quote, flapping his arms like he was a chicken, like sort of like this. And the doctor who was studying the near-death experience and talking to her about it was like, what? Like, that's strange. So he went and talked to this doctor, and he asked, you know, like, were you doing this motion at all? And he found that this doctor, one of the things that he does when he comes into the room is to keep everything sanitary. He puts his gloves on, and he doesn't touch anything. He points with his elbows to all the things that he wants his like his helping staff to do, whether he wants them to go and get a tool or go and do something. He was doing this and pointing with his elbows. So again, these just unexplainable things that people who are leaving their bodies see and witness. I mean, how do you make sense of that?
Let's continue on this wave. A Autoscopy. I think that's how you pronounce this. Autoscopy. So HE and then autoscopy. Autoscopy is the encounter with one's own doppelganger who appears as an alter ego. Patients may experience themselves to be localized at the position of the body. This is basically what you were talking about. It is difficult for the patient to decide whether or not their self is occupied within the physical body or the autoscopic body, the illusion. This blew my mind when I was researching this. I didn't expect to kind of come across this. Like, obviously, I'd considered these concepts before, but I didn't realize there was actual names for this. So this is a bit different. This is like indicating, I suppose, I guess it's more like it could be astral projection. It could be, like an alternative version of yourself. Do you know, it's funny. I've had like dreams before, which I don't know if this is the same thing, but like dreams where I felt like either I saw myself or I saw friends, but they didn't look like themselves. Like I felt in my heart that they were the same person, but they're not. They look different. They feel different somehow. Can't explain it. What do you make of this?
It could be a situation where like you're experiencing something on your near-death experience that feels like more real than this real. And this is something that I feel on psychedelics all the time. Every time I have a deep psychedelic experience, it feels like what I'm tapping into is more real than this reality here. So maybe what they're experiencing is like a disconnect, because they feel as if they're hitting like the ultimate reality, but then they're looking down at their body and they're saying like, wait, is that me? Like, am I in there, but I'm also out here? Like, how is this, and it might create some sort of like confusion or a situation where you're encountering that.
In a paper published by Jeffrey Long, MD, it is stated that near-death experiences are reported by about 17% of those who nearly die. It's a huge statistic when you really think about it. NDEs have been reported by children, adults, scientists, physicians, priests, ministers, religious people, and atheists from around the world. I just wanted to read that because I think that's incredible. Basically, all different types of people, and some of whom have every reason to question it and believe that it is not a real thing, like it doesn't exist. That is very telling, I think. While no two NDEs are the same, there are characteristic features that are commonly observed in NDEs. These characteristics include a perception of seeing and hearing apart from the physical body, passing on to or through a tunnel, encountering a mystical light, intense and generally positive emotions, a revision of oneself, and one's own prior life experiences. So, for instance, when I had Gaio Ching on my show, he spoke about being able to see lots of different things from his life all at once. This ability to, I suppose, have like an experience where you can see everything. You see it in movies sometimes, like going through everything in one's life at the same time, but being able to kind of unpack it. And he said that his experience felt like 2 weeks. Even though he was in a motorcycle accident and he was out for a few hours or an hour or something, that experience felt like 2 weeks for him. I thought that was an interesting detail, like how time, because I believe him. I don't know. I know it's scientifically not possible, but I don't know. I feel like that's real. Like when you look at if you look at time, and we talked about this at the beginning of this show, but the idea that time is not how we understand it to be, that's entirely possible within the constraints of that. If you accept those rules of time, and that's kind of key in this, is what rules of time do you accept? What are your beliefs? It always comes down to that. But with that in mind, it's completely possible that you could for instance, freeze a moment in time and explore and be in that moment for years even, and come back, and then it's like no time has passed for everyone else. Um, Also encountering dead relatives, deceased loved ones, and a chance to return to the earthly life. Now, this is a big aspect to this. So I guess my question to you is twofold. One is just kind of your thoughts on those various different types of near-death experiences, but also that final one, the choice to return to the body. We hear about this a lot. We see it in movies. What do you make of that? The idea that you're given a choice to come back.
It's a super interesting one because not all people do get that choice. Some people
Mm-hmm.
feel the autonomy and they're able to get that choice. But like the guy I interviewed, Bill Letson, he had the choice and he was like, hell no, I am not going back there. This is awesome. Like my friends, my family are here. Like this is my home. You know, a lot of times they have a sense of being home and being where they came from or where they were meant to be. And they don't want to go back. But then whoever is the authority of the situation is like, nah, you're going back. And they send them back. So it's like, it's so strange to me whether or not you get the chance. Like, what does that depend on? Is it a part of like the life review type of thing that you see in a lot of these spiritual traditions that say like, oh, after you die, you get this life review where you see, you know, what you've done, how much love you've given, how much damage you've done or whatever. So maybe it's part of that. Maybe depending on what you do, if you have like more work to do on this plane of existence, because I think a lot of people do get that sense where it's like, no, it's not your time yet. Like you have things you have to do down there before you're able to fully transition to up here. It just so happens that like you got a little taste of this because of an accident or because of something that happened. So maybe it's that.
Which begs a very important question, because you tapped on something there that I've always wondered deeply. What do you make of when people are taken before their time? For example, tragic accident, someone passes away in a car accident at the age of like 16, or a child passes away in really tragic circumstances, whatever. There's been no time there for that human being to have a human experience, to really, you know, learn the lessons that need to be learned. What do you make of that?
So the way I like to think about this is through like a Buddhist karma cosmology,
Okay.
where you live, it's sort of like you have this higher self, that soul, that spirit. And what that spirit does is it lives multiple incarnations according to what its karma is. And a
Sure.
lot of people consider karma to be like, I do something bad and then I'm going to get something bad in return.
Okay.
And it's a cool idea, but the original idea of what karma is more along the lines of like your life's work. You know, what your work is in this biological form that's going to serve your higher self or serve your soul, whatever it is that may be. So in the form of like, say, a child who gets hit by a car, tragically dies, it's said that, well, that incarnation had finished its karma, and now it's time for that incarnation to move on. You know, for that higher self, or that soul that's inhabiting that biological form, to move on to the next realm, and then to eventually be sent back down into another incarnation to complete, you know, a different set of, you know, karmic resolution or something along those lines. So that's the way I like to think about that.
Yeah, I like to think about that concept too, but I suppose then it comes down to the whole question of, yeah, do you believe in reincarnation and such? And I think if you're talking about karma, certainly I would agree with that. But what you touched on there was an interesting concept. And I know that when you say life's work, you mean more about like the lessons an individual has to learn in um, each lifetime. But I also like to think about like, oh, what value a human being has, because we all have value and we can all affect each other in a profound way. And, you know, you think about sometimes people would dedicate their lives to hurting others, other people dedicate their lives to helping others. It all comes down to choice. And I wonder sometimes if the people that choose the wrong path, so to speak, if they get a chance for redemption in other lifetimes. But then See, a lot of being a human is down to circumstance, though, and the cards you're dealt. You often hear that concept in life. You get given the cards you're dealt, and then it's up to you to work with those cards and make something out of that. And sometimes when you look at people, especially when you look at like extreme scenarios, like let's say like a serial killer or something like that, and you often hear people say, "Oh, well, you know, they were never really given a chance in life. You know, they experience really terrible things from birth, and you know, they were always destined for this path." But then other people have similar experiences and then turn out to be wonderful people or live normal lives. Equally, sometimes you have people that have wonderful upbringings and then just turn into horrible people. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, possibly Jeffrey Dahmer had a scenario like that where his childhood was quite normal and conventional, but then he turned into like this horrific serial killer. Point that I'm trying to raise with this is that there's no like set kind of, you know, like, oh, well, if you're born into this, this is what your life will become. It comes down to choice, but it also comes down to the feelings a human being has. And, you know, you can argue that it's just mental illness. That could be an argument. You could say, oh, well, if someone grows up to become that and grows up to only ever do bad things in life, then maybe it's as a result of that. But then there are people who definitely aren't ill. They're just bad people, which then begs the question, like, how can you be born evil, born a bad person? You know, you take someone like, okay, it's slightly down a controversial route, but like Adolf Hitler. If you take that human being, you can argue that all of the decisions he made as a human being all kind of built up from one area over time and led him down the route that he went on. But then there's, you know, there's like questions of like, maybe it would have been all different. You know, what if he'd have got into art school? You know, it's the old joke of maybe it would have been very different for him. Who knows? Maybe he always had that hatred in his heart and it just manifested itself in the way that it did later down the line. I guess what I'm trying to say with this is that, like, you're talking about redemption and karma and everything like that. How is it possible for a human being to have any control over that?
That's the mystery, right? Like, why is one person's karmic path like a Nazi prison guard, and then the other person's karmic path is Mother Teresa, you know?
Yeah.
And that's why I like, you know, I like to talk about, like, on my podcast, we talk a lot about like the concept of there not being anything that is ever done in the form of hate. And we talk about Hitler in regards to that, but I think it's easier to talk about it in the form of like a Nazi prison guard. And this is a Jordan Peterson thing. If you ever listen to him speak, he talks a lot about this. And it's like Nazi prison guards were just people. You know, they were people that are born into a certain circumstance where they've gone down a path and they're like a result of their environment. You know, nobody thinks that they could become a Nazi prison guard until it happens, because these things happen very, very slowly over time. And I think it's important for human development to understand that that Nazi prison guard, part of him is in you. Part of all of the evil that has ever been done throughout the world, it's in all of us. And it's a matter of again, like you said, your choices. Do you choose to act on that? And what determines that? Is there some sort of like deterministic, like, again, if you want to go back to like the spiritual Buddhist cosmology of karma, like, is there something that determines whether or not your karmic path leads in a direction of like evil or a direction of love? And it's a really difficult paradox to balance in your mind, because you don't want to think that any of us are capable of these evil, heinous acts. But I think it's important to realize the humanity in everyone, and to understand that, you know, we do have the autonomy and the responsibility to make the right choices, to not turn into that, and to maybe correct our karmic path if it does end up being an evil one.
This is why I think shows like The Walking Dead and The Last of Us, more recent show, are brilliant. I know people like to say, like, "Oh, it's cool, the zombies and all the effects and all that stuff." The storyline is where it's at because it's a perfect reflect. No, those shows are not about zombies. Those shows are not about anything to do with the viruses, any of that stuff. That's neither here nor there. That's like a tiny part of it. Those shows are about human beings, the human experience. In one of the very first episodes, spoilers, um, of The Last of Us, it's set 20 years after the fact. You see the beginning of this outbreak, and then 20 years later, you see a man who's been through it all. And one of the lines he said this in the video game as well: "I've been on both sides." What does that mean? I've been the good guy and the bad guy. But the way they tell the story and the way they imply it is that he was a victim of circumstance, of choices. But it was all within the frame of survival. The Walking Dead really goes into detail with this, particularly in later seasons when communities come together and they're accepting new people in. And one of the things, when they're accepting people in and they say like, "Oh, we just have to be careful with this, but hey, we've all done things we regret." They all say that. Every single character says that because they've all had to do things they regret. And what they mean by that is killing other human beings in order to survive. They all know it's wrong, but they all had to do that for whatever reason to protect themselves because survival was the name of the game. Right now, we live in a society where survival is still the name of the game, but we have a society where there is an ability to sustain ourselves without resorting to violence. Now, when you add scarcity into that framework, suddenly people do become violent. We saw a little glimpse of that in the beginning of the pandemic when people were like going crazy over like toilet rolls and stuff, which was hilarious. But also, I looked at that and I was like, wow, we're just as bad as the media and the movies would have us believe. We panic, not all of us. Some of us don't panic and some of us think it through and think in a logical way, but we do panic. But then you see these amazing things that happen in nature. I want to move away from humans for a second, that kind of prove that there's this capacity for love, even in a moment of survival. For example, I saw something recently where it was like a hamster in a cage, and there was another hamster within the same cage who was trapped within some sort of device they devised. It wasn't in pain or anything, but they devised a scenario where one of the hamsters could help the other hamster and get them out, but it would involve giving away some of their food. And they chose to go in that path to save the other hamster, even though by giving some of its food, it halves its survival chances. It still chose the route of selflessness. And that's kind of the more positive aspect of this, is this idea that, you can choose to do the selfless thing, even though it puts your life at danger or it potentially prevents you from continuing on. Interesting concept. What do you make of that?
It brings to mind there's this study, and it wasn't like life and death, but it was a study on play. And they had like these two rats. One was big, one was little. And the way that they play is it's like they fight, like most animals when they play. And what they noticed is that the larger animal, and this is like an infinite games versus finite games situation. There's a book by James Carse where he goes over this. And so what happens is in order to keep the game playable and infinite, the larger mouse lets the smaller mouse win like 30 to 40% of the time in order to maintain the infinite game so that they continue to play. Because if the smaller mouse loses every single time, the smaller mouse won't play anymore.
Yeah.
So it's almost like this weird, loving, like need to want and keep this game going where they interact. And it's just, you wouldn't think that animals have the capacity to do this, but they definitely do. And you can see it in nature everywhere.
There's a website called the Near-Death Experience Research Foundation, or NDERF, which includes over 5,000 experiences and counting from around the world. I should have raised this really earlier when we were talking about the abundance of experiences. They describe an NDE as a lucid experience associated with perceived consciousness apart from the body, occurring at the time of actual or threatened imminent death, basically. I thought I'd just share that with us. But I found some interesting sort of studies that they've done off the back of like surveys and stuff. One of them, and this speaks on the idea of heightened awareness, they did a survey conducted in 2014 where they asked people, how did your highest level of consciousness and alertness during the experience compared to your normal everyday consciousness and alertness? Of the 1,122 people surveyed, 74% indicated that they had more consciousness and alertness than normal. 20% experienced normal consciousness and alertness, and 5.2% had less consciousness and alertness than normal. The survey also asked people, if your highest level of consciousness and alertness during the experience was different from your normal everyday consciousness and alertness, please explain. In response to this question, people commonly reported that consciousness during their experiences was clear, more aware, and often associated with heightened awareness. Now, this again touches on what we kind of spoke about earlier, but it's like, I guess what you were framing earlier about the idea that it's tapping into something that we are otherwise unaware of. Maybe heightened abilities could be that. I hear a lot of the time in the East of like your monks supposedly doing these out of body experiences or like levitating and stuff. I don't know where I sit on that. I'll believe it when I see it. But at the same time, I mean, hey, look, here it's backed by science. It's like this is people's experiences, thousands of people, experiencing the same thing. And this is where, like, because often I feel like in scenarios like this, it becomes a battle. It's science versus, belief. And I feel like the two can work in tandem with each other. I don't for a minute discount or discredit science or say, oh, no, it's not. It couldn't be this, couldn't be that. I think you should always be open to the possibility that, hey, sometimes things might just be stats and figures, and that's just it. But there's a lot that science can't explain, and there's a lot of things that, and the amazing thing is there's many scientists out there that will sit and theorize on a more philosophical level when it gets to that point. And I think that's the best way to look at it, is it's we'll explain the majority of what we can explain with science, and when we can't explain it anymore with science, that's when we start going into philosophy. One study reviewed by Dr. Janice Holden found that many accounts of near-death experiences also reported out-of-body experiences that accurately observed events that were completely unexpected by the people who had experienced the NDEs. This further argues against NDEs as being a result of illusory memories originating from what the NDEers might have experienced during a close brush with death. This could imply that experiences could not have been produced from earlier memories, meaning the patients could have somehow been present and have witnessed events that occurred outside of themselves. And I thought this was important to kind of add in, especially what we spoke about earlier, because it would be very easy to kind of discredit and say, oh, this is just, distortions of the brain. This is things that have happened before. But equally, when you're dreaming, you have experiences that are seemingly not possible. For example, I've dreamt the future before. I don't know how, but I've done it. And the weird thing about it is that how I knew that I did it is that I dreamt whatever I dreamt at a certain point in time, and then years later it came into fruition. And I had a memory of that dream years later, and I'm like, so basically it was deja vu, but I dreamt it before. So it's deja vu connected with the previous dream, and it messed with my head. It's happened 2 or 3 times in my life. The two that stand out was, and I think I said this on the show before, in my dreams episode, but I'll recount it here. So one of the experiences was I was in a girlfriend's bedroom when I was a teenager. I sat down on the bed, looked at the doorway, and I was like, boom, it just hit me. But that was less that it was kind of because it was the first time it had happened. I kind of remember dreaming it, but I was also like, oh, maybe it's just deja vu. This is weird. Years later, during a college course, I was sitting in class looking around the room, and boom, deja vu hit me. But I remembered having a dream of that years prior. I was like, wow, okay, this is the second time this has happened now. There's something more to this. Visions in near-death experiences of people that are blind. Now, this is really interesting. Including totally blind people from birth have been described in many case reports. This shows evidence that NDEs are not a product of what NDEers would have expected to occur during a life-threatening event, and that perhaps more is at play. Now, I wanted to kind of explore this a little bit because if you've been born with blindness from death and are able to make an account of things that you've never seen, this is an interesting path to quickly jump down, because it's like, we know that in the human, existence, a person that's born blind will never be able to see, unfortunately. But how are they able to then see things that they've never experienced or seen before, or cannot really explain in words, but now they're able to because they've seen it outside of themselves? What do you make of this?
Well, there seems to be a way of experiencing that is sort of on a higher level, or maybe pushes past the senses. And we interpret that and we come back down to this reality, and we try to describe it in terms of our senses and our language and all of this, but it's a different thing because it's an experience that transcends all of that. I've heard experiences of people who were blind and they say smoke DMT or take mushrooms, and they see in like the same types of visual geometric patterns and shapes and things like that that I would see being
Really?
a person who, yeah, it's very interesting because it's like, generally what happens when you take a psychedelic, or at least if you do it in the way that I like to do it, is you take the substance, put on some music or something in a dark area, and you close your eyes and you see magnificent things. And that'll happen whether or not your eyes can see or your eyes can't see, because you're seeing in a different way. It's a visionary experience, but not in the form of like optics in your eyes. It's like it's a different type of experience where you're having the experience of seeing something, but you're not physically seeing it with your eyes, which I guess would be how a blind person can perceive something under those types of situations.
Amazing, isn't it?
It is.
It really makes me think like there's just so much we don't know. There's so much we don't know that we're not tapping into. And once we realize that, it's gonna, hey, who knows? Go back to AI. Maybe that's what they'll help us realize, all the things we don't realize that we don't know.
That's why these experiences change people's lives, because they see something that could not exist. Mm-hmm. Like these things in the physicalist, like scientific paradigm that we're brought up in cannot exist. And then when you realize that they actually do exist because you can experience them, that's why they call them magic mushrooms, because they are magic. Magic is real, and it's just a few bites away.
He's just being the ultimate salesman right now.
Yep. So I'll sell it forever. I've been employed by the mushrooms to spread their message.
Jeez. All right. A few more things before I get into some of the more stats and, basically the next stage of this show is I want to kind of actually start recounting people's near-death experiences. Because fun fact, originally when I planned this show, it was just going to be me and Josh sitting, exploring it, and that was it. But then I floated the idea on Reddit, got a bunch of people reach out to me about wanting to share their experiences. I was like, wow, okay, I'm running with this. And then also, as I was doing my studies, I just found lots of accounts, as would, and I just thought I'd read out some of them on the show and maybe just get our both of our kind of thoughts on that. Anyway, let's continue with this. So, the occurrence of a cardiac arrest while under general anesthesia is a combination of circumstances in which no memory from that time should be possible. And I've got an illustrative example here. Let me see if I can find it. I hope I can find it. I might not be able to find it. Got it. I got it. Good thing I made titles. This is what the guy said. During my surgery, I felt myself lift from my body and go above the operating table. The doctor told me later that they had kept my heart open and it stopped for a long time, and they had a great amount of difficulty getting my heart started again. That must have been when I left my body, because I could see the doctors nervously trying to get my heart going. It was strange to be so detached from my physical body. I was curious about what they were doing, but not concerned. Then, as I drifted farther away, I saw my father at the head of the table. He looked up at me, which did give me a surprise, because he'd been dead now for almost a year. What's on that?
Incredible. It's just so odd that like people can leave their bodies and then they can see an account of something happening that they should not be able to see. And they can come out of it and describe that account. And man, like the fact that a lot of people tend to see like past relatives and things like that, which brings to mind like this concept of a soul family where like you travel with certain souls and you don't incarnate into new biological forms until all of those people have passed on, and then you all kind of like, meet in celebration and then, get zapped into your new biological incarnation or something like that. But it's amazing.
Man, I'm so glad I get to do this show. I really am. An NDE or NDEs survey, it's the same company that I was talking, well, organization I was talking about earlier, asked 1,122 near-death experiences. Did your vision differ in any way from your normal everyday vision in any aspect, such as clarity, field of vision, colors, brightness, depth perception, degree of solidness, transparency of objects, etc.? In response, 722, so 64%, answered yes. 182, 16% said uncertain, and 218, 19.4% responded no. A review of narrative responses to this question revealed that vision during NDEs was apparently subnormal. Here are some illustrative examples from NDEs. Colors were beyond anything I had ever seen. Everything seemed so much more colorful and brighter than normal. This one's interesting. My vision was greatly increased. I was able to see things as close or as far as needed. There was no strain involved. It was almost like auto-zooming a camera. This is mind-blowing.
Amazing. It's like, it's that more real than real thing, And
Yeah.
if you're not, like, if you're experiencing vision that's not coming from your eyes, then like, why would it be beholden to the limitations of eyes, right? I've heard people take psychedelics and have weird meditative experiences where like they become a hawk or something, and they can see the insane vision where you can look at like a worm a mile away as a hawk, you know what I mean? And you can see that, and you can have that type of vision, and experiencing that can really just change the way that you feel about what experience is in general. It's out of control, man.
The NDEs website, NDEs, I keep mispronouncing that, has received additional case reports of near-death experiences among those legally blind. For illustration, the following NDE happened to a lady called Marta, a 5-year-old blind girl who walked into a lake. And this is what she said. I slowly breathed in the water and became unconscious. A beautiful lady dressed in bright white light hauled me out. Sorry, a beautiful lady dressed in bright white called me out. The lady looked into my eyes, asked me what I wanted. I was unable to think of anything until it occurred to me to travel around the lake. As I did so, I saw detail that I would not have seen in quote unquote real life. I could go anywhere, even to the tops of trees, simply by my intending to go there. I was legally blind. For the first time, I was able to see leaves on trees, birds' feathers, birds' eyes, details on telephone poles, and what was in people's backyards. I was seeing far better than 20/20 vision. I know we sort of spoke about this earlier, but it's, again, just kind of reiterating what we said before. I suppose the bigger implication of that is the abilities that exist beyond human life are non-restrictive, but they are restrictive in human life. That's probably the best way I could put that.
Yeah. So like, what are the implications of that? What does that mean, in terms of like what we consider to be real? Because we look at reality through just our senses. And to think that there's something that exists beyond that is just amazing.
Here's an experience from a deaf person. I approached the boundary. No explanation was necessary for me to understand. At the age of 10, that I once crossed the boundary, I could never come back. Period. I was more than thrilled to cross. I intended to cross, but my ancestors over another boundary caught my attention. They were talking in telepathy, which caught my attention. I was born profoundly deaf and had all hearing family members, all of which knew sign language. I could read or communicate with about 20 ancestors of mine and others through telepathic methods. It overwhelmed me. I could not believe how many people I could telepathize with simultaneously. I mean, it's this idea that, like, in death or in an experience like that, again, there's no limitations, but it's almost like the problems, if you like, are automatically fixed. Oh, you can't hear? No problem. We can just talk in telepathy. There it is.
Because your higher self has no limitations. It's not beholden to those senses. Yeah.
I wanted to save this one till last. There's still a few more, but this is the last of the kind of accounts that I found through journals. Because, oh my God, it's a rabbit hole. Like, just, oh my God, when I did the research for this, I was like, damn. Replaying your life. I went into a dark place with nothing around me, but I wasn't scared. It was really peaceful there. I then began to see my whole life unfolding before me, like a film projected on a screen, from babyhood to adult life. It was so real. I was looking at myself, but better than a 3D movie, as I was also able and capable of sensing the feelings of the persons I had interacted with through the years. I could feel the good and bad emotions I made them go through. This blew my mind when I read this. Imagine that. You feel how everyone that you ever interacted with felt. Oof.
And see, I've had that experience through psychedelics.
Really?
Yeah. And my fiance had a really interesting experience like that with psychedelics, where she had like this visionary experience where she sat down on a bench and all the people in her life, good and bad, were like sitting down next to her, and they were just like, hey, what's up? And they were kind of like mending the relationships. It's so interesting. So again, these parallels between some of the places you go with psychedelics and your death experiences are just, I can't explain it. Oh, and dude, I do have to say, real quick,
go for it.
I think the reason that my computer was messing up is because there might be a problem with my power supply, because my computer is charging, but it's continuously like dying, and now it's at 17%. So it might die. So I think I got to take it somewhere and get it fixed, because the power supply might be messed up. So I don't have too much more time until it dies.
It's very profound. You don't have much time left, huh? The moment of death is near. It reminds me of that moment in there's a movie called The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. You're waiting to watch that movie. It's amazing. there's a moment where he's in like I don't know, the Himalayas or something. Oh no. Is it the Secret Life of Walter Mitty? It's either that one or Hector's Search for Happiness, one of the two. But in the movie, he's in the Himalayas. I think it's Hector's Search for Happiness, actually. And he gets to the door and he says to this guy, he's like, oh, and he's like a monk, right? He's like, oh, yeah, I don't have much time. Like, because he means like he's stressed, he's on a tight schedule. And the guy is like, of course, I understand. Like the moment of death is, is of course it's a profound moment. It could happen at any time. And it kind of hits Hector. He's like, oh, man. Yeah, like he wasn't expecting that kind of response. Shout out to Vilma. Thank you so much for being such a big supporter of the show. She always sends in questions, responses, everything. Massive thank you. And thank you to everyone that listens to the show and watches the show. She sent this in. This was her father's near-death experience, and I had to read this out. Years ago, my father ended up in hospital here in Corfu for a silly infection. Unfortunately, the nurse at the hospital, while trying to insert a tube into his lung in order to remove some fluid that he had built up there, she pierced the lung in a way she shouldn't have, and my father started hemorrhaging internally. He became very weak and yellow in a matter of hours. But the doctor and nurse didn't want to own up to their mistake and kept saying that this is normal. While they were there, just waiting for him to die, and then present the course of death as due to an elusive inner hospital infection. She's put in brackets, bastards. I agree, bastards. My mother moved heaven and earth and managed to board him on a plane and take him to a big hospital in Athens, almost on his last breath. Wow. When the doctors saw him there, she said that he was on the brink of death and rushed him to surgery, sorry. My father remembers himself waking and sleeping on the plane, being under bright lights and hearing people talking, when suddenly he said everything became very quiet and peaceful. He then saw himself hovering over his bed in the surgery and thought how strange this is. He blinked and he found himself on a green hill, looking down at a beautiful valley with trees, flowers, rivers, and people lying on the grass, reading, sleeping, and felt a sense of happiness and perfect peace. He thought it was very beautiful and wanted to go there. But then he said that he realized he was not alone standing on that hill. So he turned around and told someone who was next to him and whom he doesn't remember seeing at all, "This is beautiful, but not yet. I want to go back to my family." The next thing he remembers was waking up in the recovery room where a doctor actually told him, "Welcome back." Damn.
Again, this choice, the choice to whether or not you can come back or you want to come back, it's so prevalent in these experiences.
I've got a few responses from Reddit. Not many. I posted, "What's your near-death experience? What did you see?" onto Ask Reddit, and they deleted it like almost instantly, which is a shame. But I got a few responses. I don't know. I haven't read any of these, so I don't know if they're good or bad. I will read them as I go, and if there's any dodgy ones, I'll just won't read them. The first one, the person says, "I huffed too much nitrous oxide, and I think I literally did die. At first, 1 minute seemed like 10 hours, and then I passed out with blue lips." They said, "Death is absolute meaningless." Absolute nothingness, sorry. Damn. Someone else said they had the same experience. No concept of time or place or anything. It was just nothing. Another person said they attempted suicide in 2018. Thankfully, was caught before I was too far gone, and it was irreversible. I'm gonna be honest. I saw nothing, but upon being brought back, and for a few days left mute and in no control of my motor functions, the reality of its impact on my family and not just being able to comfort them in any way past a grunt and trying to tap them on the arm because of the amount of shit I had taken fucking my system up. That was horrific. Final one, overdosed a few years back. It was black nothingness, yet somehow I was consciously aware of it. It felt like floating in space with no stars or planets, no thoughts, just nothing. It was like taking a nap in a dream. This is a good way to kind of wind things down for today's show. Hmm. What do you think, Josh? Near-death experiences. We've gone through a lot today. Over 2 hours worth of just from everything, every angle. For you, what do you make of it all?
Man, there's thousands and thousands and thousands of accounts throughout thousands and thousands of years, throughout all types of cultures. And I'm really glad that there are a core group of people who are working really, really hard to uncover just what the hell is going on here. And the fact that they coincide so directly with some of the experiences that I've had on psychedelics makes me believe them, for one, and just furthers my interest in what in the world this stuff is, because one of the main questions that I have, whether it's psychedelic, spirituality, all of this stuff, obviously is, what happens when we die? What else is out there? What exists beyond us? And near-death experiences are just another facet of how we can potentially discover the truth of our existence and the truth of what this reality is that we're in.
I know I'm going to be sitting with this for some time after this episode. Massive thank you, Josh, as always. It's been an absolute pleasure. As we wind things down for today, do you have any upcoming projects, upcoming episodes you want to shout out? Anything else you're working on, or maybe just some final thoughts that you want to share with the listeners?
Well, first, I just want to thank you, Christian, so much for having me on your show again. It's always a great time, man. I love how open you are. And I love how you've been kind of slowly going down this rabbit hole deeper and deeper as I've seen you grow and as I've seen you, continue. And that's been amazing. I love it. As far as my show is concerned, pursuitofinfinity.com. We're on every podcast platform, YouTube. I've been dedicating a lot more time to YouTube than normal, doing shorts and all that kinds of stuff too. So yeah, if anybody, has any interest in this kind of stuff, head on over there and check us out.
Absolutely, man. Thank you, by the way. Thank you very much. And yeah, I feel the same way about your show. I think it's a solid show that you got going over there. And yeah, excited to see where it goes next. Thank you so much for being on the show, man. I know it's just a matter of time until the next one. I think I'm actually, I'm appearing on your show soon. So I can't wait for that.
Yeah, man,
and look out for that,
great.
everybody. Yeah, we're going to have some good time. I'm excited to see what we chat about. But yeah, massive thank you, man. And to all the listeners of the Christian Reeve Podcast, I hope you've enjoyed this episode as much as I have. I'm glad we finally got there. We finally did it. There will be a few more episodes on near-death experiences in the coming months and weeks. But for now, be safe, be well, and to see you in the next one.